Would you believe me if I told you that Mike the Headless Chicken lived without a head for 18 months before he finally kicked the bucket? Would you believe me if I told you that a little mantis shrimp can punch objects with the force of a .22 caliber bullet? Would you believe me if I told you that one 18-inch pizza is more pizza than two 12-inch pizzas? Something about the math, it's crazy. Would you believe me if I told you that a hippo's jaws opened wide enough to fit a sports car inside? Would you believe me if I told you that adding salt to pineapple actually makes it sweeter? Uh-huh. Would you believe me if I told you that you are 10 times more likely to get bit by a New Yorker than a shark? It's true. Last but certainly not least, would you believe me if I told you that Pastor Mason can stick an entire golf tee up his nose? Believe it or not, all of these facts are true. Or at least I assume so because that's what the internet told me, right? And maybe there are some of these where you're like, oh yeah, of course, I've heard that before. I know, I've been bit by a New Yorker before. That's absolutely true, you know? But there's also plenty of these other facts where you're like, there's no way. How could that possibly be true? And whenever we face facts that are unbelievable, what do we need? Physical evidence, don't we? We often need physical evidence to prove what we don't believe. So if you don't think that Mason can stick an entire golf tee up his nose, ask him, and he'll show you. The one condition that he told me is that you had to bring the golf tee. If you supply the golf tee, he'll show you. I've seen him do it. It's insane. What was that, Andy? He gets to keep it, yeah. So you probably don't want it back. You probably don't want the golf tee back. And that's exactly why I think it's so hard for some people to believe in the resurrection today. To believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead. They need to see it to believe it. They need physical evidence. We're wrapping up a 5-week sermon series we've been in called The Passion. So if you're visiting today, if you're catching up to speed, here's kind of a summary of what we're looking at. The word passion doesn't just mean a strong emotion or an intense desire or an enthusiasm towards something, right? Like I am passionate about Chipotle burrito bowls, right? Passion actually comes from the Latin word pati, which literally means suffering. So through this 5-week series, we've been looking at core events during Christ's Passion Week. The triumphal entry, the opposition that Jesus faced, the trial before Pilate, the crucifixion on the cross. All of these were key events during Christ's Passion Week, during his week of suffering that ultimately led to, today, Easter Sunday, the resurrection. So if you've missed these sermons, if you scan the QR code on that Connect card, actually it'll bring you to a whole host of different links in which you can find our podcast. You can catch up on these sermons anytime you want this week. For those who maybe are a little newer, give us a sub too while you're at it. But here's the deal, right? Like we're on the best day of the year. I mean, yes, Christmas is the most wonderful time of the year, but the only reason we have Christmas is because of Easter. This is the Sunday when he rises from the dead. This is the day when we celebrate that death has been vanquished. Sin has been overcome. We have been restored. We have been made right with God as long as we believe in the work that Jesus did. How could Christ possibly still be suffering today? That's the question. Because even today, after he ascended into heaven and he lives in eternity with God the Father, preparing the way for us to come back to him, for us to be fully restored at the end of all things, Christ is still alive today. But I believe that even though maybe he doesn't suffer physical anguish, physical suffering like he did then, I still think Jesus suffers in a way. And that suffering is specifically because there are still people who doubt the resurrection. People who don't believe that what he did was real. And I mean, we can think all across the board. We have so many examples of how that is true for people in our culture today. But it was also very true for those who were witnessing Jesus' own resurrection right then and there 2,000 years ago. So that's what we're diving into today. If you have your Bible or a Bible app and you want to read along with us, turn to Luke chapter 24. We're reading out of the New Living Translation, the NLT as usual. So this is the third gospel of the New Testament. If you don't have a Bible, download the Bible app, or you can even just search for the passage Luke 24 NLT, and it'll most likely bring it up in your search engines. We want you to know how to navigate Scripture. We want you to know how you can read along with us. So that's why we encourage you to do so. But just to catch us up to speed, what we're going to find in Luke 24 is that it doesn't just cover the resurrection story. It actually covers 3 stories of people who doubted the resurrection even happened. 3 different instances of doubt. And I think we're going to find the parallels from their doubt to our doubt today are pretty similar in certain ways. So let's start in Luke 24, beginning in verse 1. Let's check out this first story. But very early on Sunday morning, the women went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. They had found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. So they went in, but they didn't find the body of the Lord Jesus. As they stood there puzzled, 2 men suddenly appeared to them, clothed in dazzling robes. The women were terrified and bowed with their faces to the ground. And then the men asked, "Why are you looking among the dead for someone who is alive? He isn't here. He is risen from the dead. Remember what he told you back in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be betrayed into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, that he would rise again on the 3rd day." Then they remembered that he said this. So they rushed back from the tomb to tell his 11 disciples and everyone else what had happened. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and several other women who told the apostles what had happened. But the story sounded like nonsense to the men, so they didn't believe it. Okay, so Luke includes a really interesting detail there at the end. Because you got to imagine, if you're anybody hearing the story that there are 2 angels sitting there by Jesus' empty tomb and tell you that Jesus has risen from the dead, that probably sounds a lot like nonsense in itself, right? But what Luke specifically says at the end of verse 11 is that it sounded like nonsense to the men. It sounded like nonsense to the men. Because we have to go back and understand a little bit of what's happening from a cultural standpoint here, 2,000 years ago, okay? 2,000 years ago, the New Testament took place in a patriarchal society, in which case men did everything. I mean, they worked for everything. They were in government for everything. They carried the information, delivered the news to everybody. They were educated. They were literate. Whereas the women took care of the families. They stayed at home. They were illiterate. They did not work near as extensively as the men did. And therefore, they were often very unreliable sources of information. They just didn't have access to the knowledge that men did. So because of that, these men were like, what have you been smoking, Mary? Like that's literally what they probably were wondering. So just to give like some more common parallels to today, can you think of someone in your life who is just notorious for bringing false information? For me, that is my 3-year-old toddler. Right, coming home telling stories of whatever's, like right now her current thing is she needs to get all the bears out of her room before she goes to bed. You're like, okay, yeah, sure, okay, all right, let's go with it. Probably not going to believe her. Maybe for others of you, there is a coworker who's just notorious for blowing numbers way out of proportion for their reports. Maybe there's a news outlet that we focus on that always messes up and lies about the other side of the political aisle, right? Just to defame them. Maybe you have that crazy uncle who's just always posting conspiracy theories. We all have those people in our life some way, somehow. So just imagine if this person in your life, notorious for talking about false information, creating false stories, comes to you with a story that is actually factual for once. Would you believe them? Probably not. Probably not. And so that's what was going on here in this cultural moment with these women. They're thinking, this has got to be crazy. They thought it was nonsense. And so the first form of doubt that the disciples witnessed of Christ's resurrection pertains specifically to who was delivering the news. The person, the reporter, who is bringing the news. And I think if you zoom out to our context today, thank goodness, men and women are much more equal today than it was 2,000 years ago in that patriarchal society. But the form of doubt that still occurs to people who don't know Jesus comes specifically from us as Christians. They might look at us as Christians and say, well, you don't believe in science. How could your word be true? Don't you know people don't rise from the dead? Further, maybe they say, well, we know that you claim to be, followers of a loving God, and yet your actions completely disprove that you follow a loving God. Or maybe even Christians try to isolate themselves from the world, and they just show up here on Sunday morning, they live in their little alcoves, and they don't even interact with those who don't know Jesus. And so, despite perhaps people truly being curious about Jesus and his resurrection, we might make it difficult for people to believe in him for whatever reason. But what's really fascinating, if you come back here to this story, verse 12 says, however, Peter jumped up and ran to the tomb to look. Stooping, he peered in and saw the empty linen wrappings. Then he went home again, wondering what had happened. So Peter didn't believe right away, but he gave the women a benefit of the doubt, went and checked it out and saw, yes, indeed, the tomb was rolled away. He wasn't fully there yet, but he pondered what was happening. He was like, maybe there's something here. There's something to this witness if he actually gave it a chance. And what's really cool, actually, the irony of the women's story is it was solely because from a cultural standpoint, the women's witness was probably considered completely nonsensical that actually proved the very fact that this was sheer evidence that the resurrection actually happened. Okay? Here's what one commentator wrote about this. It said, despite these numerous female witnesses, their story is not viewed as credible. Not only is it hard to accept, but culturally such a story from women would be viewed with suspicion. So, one of the main proofs that the resurrection story is credible is realizing that the first century church would never have created a story whose main first witnesses were women. Luke is clear just how skeptical the first audience is that hears about the resurrection. In other words, if the apostles and followers of Jesus wanted to just make the story up, they would not have come up with a story equivalent to me having my toddler come up with a story that we rendered as true. They would not have chosen women as the first witnesses to prove their point. So the fact that they did is just further evidence that this was legit. And what could the parallels be for today? I think when people look at stories and they're like, I don't know about Jesus, but I see this person who I knew lived a really tragic life and was just all over the place personally, put his faith in Jesus, and his life was completely transformed. Her marriage is completely restored. He is a completely different person. She's a completely different person. And they share that testimony. That's what kind of starts to lean people in a little bit to maybe there is something to this Jesus thing. If his life, if her life, if their family was this transformed because of it, they just might start to ponder its legitimacy a little more, just as Peter did when he considered it. So that's the first form of doubt that we see in the resurrection story, specifically about who reported the news. Well, let's move into the second story here to see the second instance of doubt about the resurrection. Let's pick up in verse 13. That same day, two of Jesus' followers were walking to the village of Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. As they walked along, they were talking about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things, Jesus himself suddenly came and began walking with them, but God kept them from recognizing him. So Jesus is making a little cameo appearance here. He just kind of drops into this conversation. They don't even realize it's Jesus. He does this a lot in his post-resurrection appearances. But the Greek word here discussing the nature of these two apostles' conversation, talking is way too light of a word. The better translation would be debated or heavily and more intently discussed these things. They were disputing exactly what happened, trying to make sense of it. So when Jesus just poofs, magically appears to them, he asks in verse 17, what are you discussing so intently as you walk along? They stopped short, sadness written across their faces. Then one of them, Cleopas, replied, you must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all the things that have happened here the last few days. What things? Jesus asked. Humor me, essentially, is what he's saying. The things that happened to Jesus, the man from Nazareth, they said, he was a prophet who did powerful miracles, and he was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people. But our leading priests and other religious leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel. This all happened 3 days ago. Let's pause there for a second. So, all very legitimate reasons for sadness to be written upon their faces. Their rabbi, their teacher, their prophet was just crucified as an innocent man. That in itself is devastating. Not to mention they believed that he was the Messiah, the anointed one of God, who would come and restore the kingdom of Israel and overthrow the Roman emperor. The fact that he died just proved that he wasn't that. So that would obviously be very devastating in and of itself. But their story doesn't just stop there. They continue telling the story to Jesus with this, verse 22. Then some women from a group of his followers were at his tomb early this morning, and they came back with an amazing report. They said his body was missing, and they had seen angels who told them, Jesus is alive. Some of our men ran out to see, and sure enough, his body was gone, just as the women had said. Wait. So, okay, the first part of their story makes sense for why they were so sad. But right here, they're reporting that the men even went out there and confirmed this is true. His body is gone. They're claiming that he's alive. Why would they be so sad about this still? It's because they were debating how this could have happened. It didn't make sense to them. So Jesus, without them realizing it was Jesus, rebukes them, and he says this in verse 25, "You foolish people, you find it so hard to believe all that the prophets wrote in the scriptures. Wasn't it clearly predicted that the Messiah would have to suffer all these things before entering his glory?" Then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So in a similar way, we kind of get to that second instance of doubt for a lot of people. It's just simply doubting that the resurrection could even happen. The details of the event itself. A lot of historians will claim, the most popular arguments against is that the disciples stole the body, or that the Romans hid the body somehow, or things like that. Others might just play the science card and say, people can't rise from the dead. Right? There's a lot of people who are just skeptical about this event, but at the end of the day, really it reveals a deeper level, a deeper issue at hand with these doubts, and it's their answer to the question, does God even exist in the first place? Because if God doesn't exist for them, then they have to look at these events, all of these claims, about morality and spirituality and religion, and specifically Christianity, and they have to interpret it through that lens as their starting point. If God's not real, then all of this has to be some other figment of humanity's imagination. So similar to them, they'll hear this story despite all the other evidence around it, but it's just hard to process it because it just doesn't make sense. Maybe you've been there yourself. Those late nights on YouTube looking at you get into the deep, dark parts of YouTube of all the atheists claiming these different perspectives and why it's so difficult to, just me? Maybe just me. And trying to make sense of it. Maybe some of you are here right now. And you're like, church is great, religion is good because it helps me be a better person, but all this stuff in the Bible, surely it's not real, right? Because we sound like crazy people when we say we believe in a man who rose from the dead, let alone all the other crazy stuff that happens in the Bible, And so then perhaps Christians try to explain the same reasons for all this happening just as Jesus did. They will quote scriptures and prophecies and all this stuff from the Old Testament, but if you're someone who doesn't believe in God, let me tell you, the Bible is not a good source of information for you, It's just dabbling into a source that proves everything that you already believe, but for someone who doesn't know, that's very hard for someone to grasp who doesn't believe in God. Right? So even these two disciples, they were receiving all the logical arguments from Jesus himself for why he had to die, for why he had to rise again, but it just wasn't clicking. So finally, we get to this final scene with this second instance of what actually got them to believe. Let me tell you, it wasn't logical arguments. Let's continue in verse 28. By the time they were nearing Emmaus and the end of their journey, Jesus acted as if he was going on. But they begged him, "Stay the night with us, since it's getting late." So he went home with them. As they sat down to eat, he took the bread and blessed it. Then he broke it and gave it to them. And suddenly their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And at that moment, he, poof, disappeared. Oh, how does he do that? I don't know. He often does that. But here are these two disciples eating with Jesus. They heard all the arguments that Jesus was making, and it wasn't until Jesus broke bread, this physical symbol of, the representation of his bread breaking on the cross, right? Jesus talked about this on the night he would be betrayed with the Last Supper, but then they realized, that's him. That's him. And I know there's a lot of other stuff here, like why couldn't they recognize Jesus, post-resurrection? There's a whole, we'll go into that some other time. It's a whole other train of thought theologically. But the point is, logical arguments very rarely get someone to believe. Personal experience does. You can have all the logical arguments for why God is real, but until someone can experience God's love personally, until they can come and experience people who love him too and realize, whoa, that's a life that I can have, or until their life comes to a screeching halt with something devastating that forces them to question everything they believe and put their hope in something greater than themselves. We need doctrinal beliefs. We need these logical statements to argue and to know exactly what we believe, right? It gives us structure for how we understand the world and who God is and to make sense of Scripture. It's all really important, but I guarantee you believe in Jesus, you're Christians because of what he's done for you, because of what he keeps doing for you. And that's what people need to hear. How's God continued to transform my life? Experience speaks louder than logic ever could. We need both. Experiences speaks louder. On to the third story, shall we? So after Jesus showed up to these two disciples on their way to Emmaus, and then he just disappears, they immediately hightail right back to Jerusalem, okay? So they just got done walking 7 miles, they get to Emmaus, they eat, and they're like, we gotta go back and tell all the apostles that we saw them. And so they ran another 7 miles. They're training for their half marathon, Cody, I guess. I don't know what they're doing. But they hightail it right back there, and they tell the apostles all of these things. And poof, right in the middle of them witnessing, sharing their testimony of this, Jesus shows up to them and scares the bejeebies out of them. Peace be with you, he says in verse 36. Sup, homies, is probably what he says. But look at how the disciples respond. But the whole group was startled and frightened, thinking they were seeing a ghost. So the first set of doubt came from those who bore the witness. The second set of doubt came from exactly what happened. But the third set of doubt right here came from superstitious beliefs. They thought they were seeing a ghost. So if the second form of doubt came from reasons why the disciples couldn't believe it, this third form came from what they believed instead of the resurrection. They could not register that this was the physical body of Jesus, so they came up with an alternative belief to explain what they saw. He was a ghost. And people do a very similar thing today. Maybe they're not as quick to fill in the gaps of their belief with, paranormal activity and ghosts, but we do, talk about moral psychology for a lot of things, or science, or aliens, creating the pyramids and all sorts of other moral philosophies to try to fill in the gaps in a way that, if we answer the question that if God exists with a no, then we have to come up with some other alternative belief systems to make sense of what only God could make sense of, right? So it all can kind of be classified as modern superstition, grasping at alternative beliefs to explain what only God can do, because they need physical evidence. And if the evidence isn't proving itself, then they got to come up with something else. And so that's exactly what Jesus actually provides the disciples. It's physical evidence. Check this out, verse 38. Why are you frightened, he asked. Why are your hearts filled with doubt? Look at my hands, look at my feet. You can see that it's really me. Touch me and make sure that I am not a ghost. Because ghosts don't have bodies, as you see that I do. As he spoke, he showed them his hands and his feet. And then we get to one of my favorite little couple of verses in the entire Bible, right here in verse 41. Listen to this. Still they stood there in disbelief, filled with joy and wonder. Then he asked them, "You have anything to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he ate it as they watched. And so I'm just imagining, Jesus is just going to town on this filet-o-fish, right? He's just, sucking off like every little like sinew and protein from these fish bones, and the disciples are just like, just wide mouth staring like he's just going to town on this fish, right? Like the resurrected Jesus is eating a filet-o-fish. So funny to me. But the reason he did was to further prove his physicality. It was a bodily resurrection. He gave physical evidence. Because without physical evidence, people start creating alternative beliefs, alternative stories. And the Gospel of John actually records a specific instance of this guy named Thomas, doubting Thomas. Maybe you've heard his story before. If you haven't, here's how it goes. Somehow, Thomas missed out on this little party where Jesus shows up to the rest of the apostles, and they go back to Thomas, they're like, "Dude, Jesus showed up." He's like, "I don't believe you, bro. I'm not going to believe it until I could see it." Until one day, Jesus finally showed up to Thomas. He tells Thomas to feel the holes in his hands and to feel the holes in his feet and the hole in his side. And of course, in that instance, Thomas believed. And who could blame the guy? It is human nature to want to believe something that's unbelievable with physical evidence. We've got to see it to believe it. And yet, Jesus says this to Thomas. Then Jesus told him, "You believe because you have seen me, but blessed are those who believe without seeing me." Yeah, the disciples had it easy. They saw Jesus right then, right there, much easier to believe. But they didn't receive the blessing that we receive. That it is much better to believe than to see. And so we as a church, as the body of those who believe and don't see, we actually form the greatest physical evidence for the resurrection. A lot of skeptics think that the church created the resurrection, that they just made it up. But that's so far from the truth. Because it was the resurrection that created the church. Because you have to ask yourself, where did the church come from? Why is a church a thing, and how did it show up here? And as you start to unravel through history over the last 2,000 years ago, you get pointed to the first century where something had to have happened with this guy named Jesus, who is a historical person in the historical context. And people automatically doubt the New Testament because they're like, it's a religious text. It is a historical text. There is no other form of literature, ancient literature, that has been copied and transmitted thousands upon thousands of times like the New Testament was in its time, all across the Roman Empire. There was something about this Jesus guy that just must have changed everything for this news to spread with the wildfire that it did. Not to mention how this little sect of Judaism, this little sect of people who believed in Jesus, would slowly grow to the point where the Roman Empire would want to wipe it out, so much so that they would put Christians in colosseums and torture them with animals for sport. They would crucify Christians upside down while on fire. And yet, they still believed, so much so that until the late 300s, Christianity became the official religion of the very empire that tried to snuff it out. And the only way how Christianity could have survived that is because its followers so firmly believed it that it was worth dying the most inhumane forms of torture for. No one dies that hard for a lie, or they are the world's greatest liars that we have ever seen. So, when you flash forward all the way over to here, to us today, like, our entire religion hinges on the resurrection. It is simultaneously the most important doctrine that we could believe in as a faith body, but it's also the hardest one to believe. It takes faith. We have to believe it in order to see it. Because if the resurrection didn't happen, what is literally the point of this? You could be anywhere else right now. You could have a whole 2 or 3 hours free on your Sunday mornings. But I am willing to bet that it is legit. It's worth pursuing. It's worth telling others about. You can invite Mason back up here, and we're going to conclude in worship for a couple more songs. But before we do, after Jesus finished scarfing down his filet-o-fish, he says this to his disciples. When I was with you before, I told you that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. And he said, yes, it was written long ago that the Messiah would suffer and die and rise from the dead on the third day. But it was also written that his message would be proclaimed in the authority of his name to all the nations, beginning in Jerusalem. There is forgiveness of sins for all who repent. You are witnesses about these things. So not only does our religion, does our faith hinge on the resurrection, scriptures and prophets prophesied that this must happen, but it also hinges on us telling others about it. The only reason why we are able to sit here in this room 2,000 years later is because people told other people who told other people who told other people about the goodness of Jesus and that he rose again and that he's real and that he's alive and that he can transform your life. And yet Christianity is on a decline in our country right now. People need to know this good news. And that's why I think Jesus still suffers today. Because people are dying and going to hell, y'all. Because they don't know this. They don't know this. So that's why next week we're going to start a 7-week series called Lost Cause. Lost Cause. Because the people who don't know Jesus are, as Jesus says, lost. They are wandering like sheep without a shepherd, right? They just don't know any better. They're coming up with these alternative beliefs to try to understand how to live this life, and they are missing out on the vibrant life that only Jesus can give. So we are sent out on a cause to reach the lost. So we're going to be talking about how to share our stories with those who don't know Jesus. We're going to talk about how to make disciples. We're going to talk about how to live a life aligned with our faith, how to go on missions and to extend compassion. So many other things. Because that is our response to this good news. For those of us who believe, we need to help those who don't. There's a lot there, so that's why we're taking 7 weeks to talk about it. But in the meantime, may we not waver in our faith, even when it makes no sense, even when it seems like it's easier to just shut down and let it go. Push through. Push through.